from a chicken coop with Fred's Chicken Restaurant across the street to James Brown's last album here to the Aretha Respect movie. That's why I love vintage gear. It tells a story. Anybody who spent any time around me in the studio knows that I love microphones, specifically vintage microphones. And early on in my career here, I knew that I wanted an amazing example of a vintage Neumann U67. Now, there's a session player that comes around a lot named David Johnson, and he and I both share a love for vintage microphones.
Glenn and I have a fetish for microphones, particularly old vintage microphones. And the problem with old vintage microphones is that if they're in good working condition, they cost some old-fashioned dollars to get a hold of. And so we'll wheel and deal every now and then. I've got a hold of a couple of mics for him. There was an old studio in Marion, North Carolina, that had a U67, a vintage U67. It had never been touched. It hung in that studio from the time it was new, and it was a expensive piece of gear, a Neumann U67. I didn't make but one call. I knew who needed it.
He told me about a guy named Fred Rumfeld who had a studio in the hills of North Carolina, Marion, North Carolina, I believe it was, called Country Road Recording. And he had purchased a U67 brand new, and it sat in the corner of this studio on an old Atlas stand for years. And Fred was a nice man. We had great conversations about tape machines and vintage gear, and I asked him if he would sell me his U67. And he told me that there was a lady that liked to come to his studio about once a year and sing on that particular mic, and he wasn't quite ready to sell it yet. But he did ask, out of curiosity, Glenn, what would you offer me for it? And at the time, vintage U67s were going for about $3,000. So I said, Fred, fair market on these is about $3,000. I'd be willing to give you that. And he said, well, that's good to know. I said, Fred, if you ever decide to sell it, let me know first, because I'll be interested. And I kind of got off the phone, and that's the one that got away. You know, it's vintage gear tends to do that sometimes. And I'd forgotten about the mic, and actually about a year and a half later, I get a phone call from Fred. And Fred says, Glenn, I'm willing to sell you this U67 if you're still interested. So during that time period, vintage U67s had gone up quite a bit. All vintage gear, really. And great examples were going for about $4,000 by that point. So I said, Fred, what are you willing to take for this U67? And he said, well, we had a deal, $3,000. And I was like, man, really? I said, well, Fred, to be honest with you, they've gone up quite a bit in that time period, and I didn't want to take advantage of him. And I said, would you be willing to take $3,500? And he said, nope, we had a deal, $3,000. Kind of blew my mind. And I said, are you sure, Fred? And he said, absolutely. $3,000 is all I'll take for that microphone. And he said, actually, David Johnson's going to be here in the studio tomorrow, and I can just give him the mic because he told me he's going to be at your place later this week.
He said, can you pick it up for me? I said, I can. And I brought it to him, and of course he paid Mr. Rumfeld, the owner of the studio up there, what he wanted at that time. Glenn wanted that sound. He wanted that mic. He wasn't going to settle for a second best. I don't know what else at that time. This was long years ago. I don't know what he had to sacrifice to make that mic happen that particular month, that particular year. I don't know what his financial outlay was like, but he had it figured out. And since then, he's bought some microphones that cost more than my house. So, I appreciate that.
And sure enough, a couple days later, Dave shows up, original box, paperwork, and this beautiful mint Neumann U67. So I plugged it up, listened to it, and it was all I'd hoped for and more. It's just an amazing microphone.
He said, the microphone, no matter what kind of input gear you've got, no matter what kind of recorder you've got, no matter how nice a building you've got, he said that microphone is the first thing that sees your talent. It's got to go through that microphone before it gets processed into any other part of the recording equipment. And if that microphone is deficient in what you're trying to accomplish, then you've defeated your purpose right off the bat. It doesn't matter what comes after that microphone, what kind of cabling you've got, how nice the bathrooms you've got, how good an advertising campaign you've got. That microphone's the first and most important thing in that line of audio. And he said, if you cut corners there, he said, you've cut corners everywhere. And Glenn knew this. He knew it early on. And I've never seen him back up from that.
Now, I come to find out after that, the reason Fred decided to sell that microphone is because his daughter was involved in a car accident and she didn't make it. And he needed the money to help pay for the funeral expenses. And that really hit me, so I thought, man, I really underpaid for this microphone. And everybody likes a great deal, but I went to the office and talked to Susan and said, mail Fred a check for $1,000. I'm not even going to let him know I'm sending it, just mail it to him. And to this day, that check has never been cashed. And that's the kind of man Fred was. He was a man of his word. And I wish more people were like that today. I mean, that mic he bought new has seen and heard so much. From a chicken coop with Fred's Chicken Restaurant across the street, to James Brown's last album here, to the Aretha Respect movie. That's why I love vintage gear. It tells a story, and to this day, it's still one of my favorite microphones ever.